Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about theology. Specifically, as you know, if you have clicked on this video, the question that I want to parse through today is whether there really is such a thing as Wiccan theology. And the answer in some ways is obviously yes, and in other ways is obviously no. Wiccans like to say that we are an orthopraxy and not an orthodoxy. I have a video that I did ages ago that talks through how that's really not true. There are ways in which Wiccan practice is really not orthoprax because there's so much variation from one coven to the next. Really there is no single one thing that you can point to and say, like, this thing, this one step of this one piece of ritual, like, has to be done exactly this way across to all of Wicca. Like, there is nothing like that. For any piece of ritual that you can identify, there is variation in it. And those variations might be big or they might be small, but there are variations nonetheless. So the idea of orthopraxy really falls apart when you put it under a microscope. And likewise, there are, I argued, certain beliefs that are not required for Wicca, but that are at least assumed in the structure of Wicca. I think that Wiccan ritual is written with a couple of beliefs in mind, and you certainly don't have to believe those things in order to practice Wicca. You don't have to believe those things in order to find Wicca appealing, but Wicca was sort of designed with the assumption that the people practicing it would believe a couple of key things, and I'll reiterate those later in the video. So, I mean, there is clearly a sense in which there's some kind of coherent belief or theology or dogma underlying at least some of what Wicca is. But there's so much diversity across Wicca, and it happens so many times that I will be talking to another initiate who will be sharing, their personal perspective on something and their understanding of Wiccan theology based on the way that their coven practices, and it just seems totally different from anything that I know and anything that I'm familiar with and from my experience of the mysteries. So there's clearly also a sense in which Wicca doesn't have a unified theology. And I just want to sit in front of a camera for a little bit and kind of piece that apart and think about what we mean when we say Wiccan theology, and like what the glue is that holds Wicca together and what it isn't. So the three basic beliefs that I identified in my previous video are a belief in at least two gods. Right? Wicca is a polytheistic priesthood. You don't have to believe in gods in order to practice Wicca, and I do know a couple of atheist initiates. But Wiccan ritual is structured around two gods, and there is, kind of an implicit assumption that you believe in at least two gods. And if you don't, then the onus is kind of on you to figure out why you find Wiccan ritual valuable and what you get out of it when the ritual is written with two gods in mind. The second belief is a belief in the efficacy of magic, right? Wicca is a witchcraft religion. Wiccans practice witchcraft. We do spells. And again, like, if you don't believe in the efficacy of magic, that's fine. You're still allowed and welcome to practice Wicca, but the onus is kind of on you to figure out what you're getting out of it if you don't think that the magic part is real, because the magic is such an integral part of what Wicca is. And then the third belief is a belief in reincarnation. This is, I think, the most up in the air of the three. I know a lot of Wiccans who don't believe in reincarnation, or who take a very abstract, like, when I die, my body will decompose and my matter will return to the earth, and eventually the, atoms that make me up will make up other living organisms, and isn't that beautiful? Like, that's certainly a line that a lot of people take. But at least, Wiccan ritual, as it's introduced by Gerald Gardner, heavily assumes that the people practicing Wicca believe in reincarnation, believe that they will be reborn, and specifically that they will be reborn to the witch cult. So those are kind of the three starting point beliefs that I think Wicca assumes. Wicca as a whole, not any individual Wiccan, but like kind of the structure of the religion, is designed with those three things in mind. But that itself does not a theology make. Right? That's not terribly robust. That doesn't tell us a lot of things about like who these gods are or how that relates to like designing Wiccan ritual or anything like that. So let's flesh it out just a little bit. Initiatory Wicca, traditional Wicca, is an initiatory priesthood centered on the experience of religious mysteries. And specifically, it's centered on the experience of the mysteries of life and death and the relationship between them. And like, because it's a mystery cult, and mysteries are things that have to be experienced in order to be understood, it gets very difficult very fast to talk specifically about Wiccan theology. Because a really important idea in Wicca is that we have these mysteries, right? We all experience life, we will all experience death, but the experience of them is something individual. It's something that no one else can do for you, and that no one can really explain to you. It's an experience you have to have for yourself. So because of that, the whole project of theology just kind of crumbles, right? You can't have even discursive theology about things that are private and experiential. But Wicca kind of creates a common space for us to have those experiences by expressing this relationship of life and death through the relationship of two gods. I don't want to get too specific with this because there is so much diversity of practice, and I don't want to make a claim for all of Wicca and have a coven in Australia go like, hey, we don't do that, or that's not, like, so big picture. Wicca gives us a framework, a ritual framework in which to experience and understand the mysteries of life and death through the relationship of two gods. And at least as Gerald Gardner initially talked about them, you have sort of this lunar mother goddess who is the goddess of life, and then you have this horned god who is the god of death. And the kind of key of Wicca is this idea that these two gods are in a relationship with each other, and that by experiencing and understanding that relationship, we can gain some kind of experience of these larger mysteries of life and death. But that itself, again, still very like basic and stripped down, and there's not a lot there, right? Like, there's not a mythology there. There's not, like, there aren't stories. There's not a robust experience of like who these gods are. We have the goddess, and she is life, and she is kind of a mother goddess, and she's associated with the moon. It's kind of all we have about her. And we have the god, who is this mysterious figure. He is horned or antlered, and he's associated with death and maybe hunting and maybe agriculture. That's kind of all we have about him. And like that basic story, I think, provides the foundation for the experience of the Wiccan mysteries, but in itself is not a robust theology. And what's happened over the course of the 70-odd years that Wicca has been around is that initiates, through their own experiences, have built up various theologies around that kind of starting point. So you have some people who have drawn on like the work of Robert Graves, and who work with this like story of the seasonal cycle, the wheel of the year, as a life cycle of the god. So the god is born at the winter solstice because he's a solar god, which interestingly, like, even the idea that the god is a solar god is something we really don't see Gardner talk about. That's something that people are producing as part of their own theology, building up from this very, very basic idea of life and death in relationship. And it's a very common idea, and it's a very natural one, right? Like if you have the moon goddess and her consort, who is the consort of the moon, it makes a lot of sense for that to be the sun. But I'm getting sidetracked. So you have some people who have this sort of Robert Graves inspired idea of like the god is born at the winter solstice, and then he grows through the waxing half of the year, and he weds the goddess and impregnates her with himself, and then he dies at the harvest and descends to the underworld, and then he's reborn again. Like, and that's a beautiful life cycle type of myth, and it's one that a lot of people find a lot of meaning in, but it's something that has been built up over time, and that not everyone in Wicca like adheres to, right? So the robust theology of that story of the Wheel of the Year is pretty common, but it's not integral to Wicca. It's not at the heart of Wicca, and there's nothing in Wicca itself that requires that myth, because what's in Wicca itself is those kind of three starting point beliefs, which, again, even those beliefs are optional. But Wicca kind of presumes those three starting point beliefs. And then the mysteries of life and death expressed through the relationship of the goddess and the god. How you're expressing that relationship and how you're finding those mysteries is kind of up to you. So, that story of the Wheel of the Year, it's a beautiful story, but you can take it or leave it. And whether you take it or leave it doesn't make you more or less Wiccan. Another example is, right, the whole triple goddess thing, which again actually goes back to Robert Graves, but not in the way that people think it does. I talk about this in Queen of All Witcheries, but Graves has a triple goddess. He refers to her as the mother, bride, and layer out, or alternatively as the girl, the woman, and the hag. The idea of maiden, mother, crone is a later sort of iteration of the triple goddess concept that does not originate with Robert Graves. But regardless, right, the idea of the triple goddess, the three phases of the moon, the phases of a cis woman's life starting from like childhood up through sexual maturity and then post-menopause, like that is a way of giving expression to the mysteries of this goddess of life. But it's a way that people have built up over time from that initial, like, very, very basic starting point. And so the idea that I'm trying to drive at here is that Wicca has kind of a skeletal theology that is genuinely Wiccan theology, that I think most of us can agree is kind of in the structure of Wicca, in the heart of what Wicca is. And even those of us who like don't hold on to certain parts of it, right? Like even those initiates who don't believe in reincarnation, I think would have no issue in saying that like Wicca is kind of designed with reincarnation in mind. Wicca is designed with this relationship of life and death in mind. And then anything more robust than that is something that people have developed later over the course of time as a way of sort of fleshing out their own understanding of these very basic kind of primal mysteries. And then they've passed those theologies on to their downlines or to the broader community, and a sort of larger discursive theology has built up over the course of Wicca's history. And you get people who are really exploring these more specific stories or these more specific theological ideas. But with any of that other stuff, it's all sort of at your discretion, and it's all sort of at your pleasure. So if you resonate with this story of like the life cycle of the god through the seasons of the year, like use it, take it on, actualize it in ritual, and explore it as a way of accessing these deep mysteries. But if that story leaves you cold, you get to drop it. And there's nothing stopping you from dropping it, and there's nothing less Wiccan about practicing a version of Wicca that accesses those mysteries of life and death through the relationship of the goddess and the god without drawing on that sort of Robert Graves style story of the seasons. So that's kind of as far as beliefs go. There are a couple of other things that I just want to like very briefly flag. One is there are certain values that I think are pretty fundamental to Wicca. One, which I have talked about in a previous video, is the empowerment of women, right? The worship of the goddess, and then the creation of a religion in which women have authority, women have a voice, there is a parity of gender. That's something that I think is really just essential to Wicca. And, I can think of at least one coven, maybe two off the top of my head, that have operated in the past that were like all male covens. And, they for political reasons, like did everything by the book when occasions really required it, and had priestesses present for certain rites. But by and large, the way that the covens operated were like all male, and they were exploring the mysteries in their own way, in a way that obviously like didn't center on that particular feminist principle. So again, these things are like not going to apply universally to everyone everywhere in all of Wicca, but I think that it's not controversial to say that Wicca starts from a place of this value of empowering women and restoring power to women, particularly in the patriarchal society of Britain in the early to mid 20th century. Likewise, I think there's a value in Wicca of life and of the things that make us feel alive. There's an idea that pleasure and happiness are goods in their own right and don't need to be justified, so that things like good food or sex or art, like these are things that are valuable and don't need to be kind of encased in shame of any kind. Again, particularly if you think about the sexual climate of Britain at the time that Wicca is forming, this is a really important key value. And I think also there is an emphasis on community that you find in Wicca, right? I talked about this in my previous video, maybe the video before. Wicca is based on covens. Wicca is structured around the idea that you are practicing with a group of people and that you are involved in an intimate, close-knit community, partly because it's valuable to have that community, it's valuable to be in relation with people, but partly also because community keeps you in check. Gardner has a story, and I think it's in The Meaning of Witchcraft, but in one of his books, Gardner has a story about a member of his coven who was absolutely furious, had been wronged by someone she knew, and was just livid. And he said, like, I really think that if the coven hadn't been there to talk her down, she might have killed him. And so, the value of a coven, not just as a community that puts you in relationship, which is a valuable thing in its own right, but then also as sort of a check on you and having other people to call you out on your bullshit and keep you wise, keep you aligned with the person that you want to be. And so those are, I think, like core values of Wicca that can then find expression in Wiccan ritual and then in the ways that people build up their Wiccan theology. So, as an example, conventionally magical partnerships in Gardnerian Wicca are heterogeneous with regard to gender. So you form a magical partnership with people who are not the same gender as you. And that is, in my opinion, and like, we'll flag this is opinion, but in my opinion, I think that's born out of that core value of making sure that women have power and authority and don't ever get sort of pushed to the side, right? The idea that, like, no, you can't do ritual without women. You can't just, like, do your witchcraft and your goddess cult and leave all the women aside. Like, you don't get to orchestrate a patriarchal takeover of the Kens. That, I think, is born out of that core political value, that core value at the heart of Wicca, that, like, this is a thing that values women and that values women's voices and women's power, and without women, this can't be done. But, that is my opinion as to, like, which one of these is the cart and which one of them is the horse, which thing is explanatorily prior. But then there are other sort of theological ideas that get built up out of that value and that practice about, like, whatever, the importance of the womb, or the, this or that, or, and again, this is kind of a, like, chicken and egg, cart and horse. Like, people will have disagreements about which one of these things comes first and results in the others. To me, the theological discussions that people have about, like, the mystical significance of womanhood in Wicca are born out of that initial value, and then people, again, sort of working with this basic skeletal theology of, like, the mysteries of life and death, the goddess expressing life, the god expressing death. People have combined that value with that skeletal theology and produced more robust theologies of their own, which they've kind of developed and passed over time. That's my take on how those theologies come into being. There are other people who will tell you that the theology is prior, and that because of the theology, we then have whatever, the political values, and then the ritual practices, and then so on. But, like, that's not my take on what starts where. And honestly, I think that's, again, really important, because not all theologies are good. Like, you have, there are a lot of theological stories that people have developed over time that were meaningful to them, and in many cases were maybe, like, very, like, powerful and progressive for the time at which they were working, right? Like, again, thinking about the milieu of the 1940s and 1950s in the UK, like, just the idea that, like, hey, maybe sex isn't such a bad thing after all, like, just radical, revolutionary. But there are a lot of ideas, and again, this is a thing that I've talked about in Queen of All Witcheries, but there are things like the triple goddess theology that really, like, links the goddess directly to the uterus and makes goddess power womb power and nothing else. And that can be really alienating for a lot of people, right? It's alienating for people who, women who aren't mothers and have no intention to be. It's alienating for like, anyone who's had a hysterectomy and, no longer menstruates, but, like, the idea that that automatically makes them a crone. It's alienating to non-binary and trans people. Like, there are a lot of different ways in which that theology maybe leaves people out, or maybe isn't ideal. But if we can identify, like, the skeletal theology, the real core of the theology, the thing that is at the heart of what we do, and then these other things are ways in which people have developed their own robust understandings of that basic framework. It means that you can kind of separate out the things that aren't working for you without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? In this case, the triple goddess is the bathwater, and the mysteries of life and death are the baby. And if you're still taking a bath, you can take on the triple goddess theology, and it's a powerful story, and it's a story that can work for you. But it's not a story that has to apply universally across all of Wicca and across the way that everyone practices. Whereas that basic, like, the mystery of life, the mystery of death, and finding a way to express them through the relationship of these two gods, that's a really... I don't want to say that you can't do without it, because I'm sure that someone somewhere is, but, like, I would be surprised if anyone in Wicca wanted to do without it, because it feels so much like the heart of what Wicca is exploring, in one way or another. And so, yeah, right, we have this kind of complex knot of, like, basic practices, basic values, basic beliefs, and then these mysteries that are inherently experiential and personal and private. And I think that really the center of Wiccan theology is the mysteries. And then everything else is built up as a way of helping us to access those mysteries. But understanding what the basics are means that we don't get tangled up in these things that other people have said. And, if you're coming into Wicca now and you're reading a book that was published in the 1970s, and it has this, big elaborate story about who the goddess is and the triple goddess and this and that and the life cycle of the god and all of these things, right? Like, if it has this really elaborate story and you're like, well, that's not for me, that doesn't mean that Wicca isn't for you. That means that this version of theology that someone has come up with to help them access those deeper mysteries isn't for you. But the mysteries themselves potentially still might be. Potentially might not be, right? Like, Wicca is not for everyone, and not everyone is interested in it, and that's legit. But just because you see some people expressing a theology, even if they're really loud and really insistent about that theology, doesn't mean that that theology sits at the center of Wicca. And really, I think the actual theology at the center of Wicca is very basic and very skeletal. So, just to give one final example, people talk a lot about polarity in the context of Wicca. Polarity is one of those theological ideas that people have built up over time, but personally, it doesn't do much for me. It used to, right? It's how I was trained, and if you read Kabbalah for Wiccans, if you read my first book, the whole book is structured around the idea of polarity as kind of the heart of Wiccan magic. But I think polarity is, more than anything else, a retroactive attempt to build up a theology around certain Wiccan practices, like gender heterogeneity in magical partnership. I think it's a sort of a retrofitting of a theology onto these more basic practices. And over time, polarity has just become less and less interesting to me, and less how I experience and how I understand the mysteries of what we're doing in the craft. So, Kabbalah for Wiccans, I maintain that it's a really good book. I do think there is nothing else out there like it. But one of the reasons that that's not a book I would write today is that this idea of polarity is just no longer a feature of my magical practice and of how I understand Wicca. And so, that book, while I think it's a good book, is just not reflective of who I am as a magical practitioner anymore. And again, polarity is a magical concept that's really meaningful to a lot of people and to a lot of Wiccans. And, yeah, go for it. If these built-up theologies, if these theologies or, magical theories or whatever that people have developed over time, if they work for you, you get to use them, and that's great. But if you look at that basic skeleton of Wicca, there's nothing about polarity in there. And it's okay to access the mysteries, to access the skeleton in other ways than what other people have built up for themselves and passed on, right? You kind of receive this legacy of theological ideas and, built up practices and ritual additions and things like that other people before you have come up with that have helped them to get at the meat of those mysteries. And the idea is hey, here, this is all for you. You can use it if you want to, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that's really valuable, because reinventing the wheel is hard. But it also means that you don't have to use it, because these are trappings that other people have built that help to them, but they might not help you. So this is a longer video. I'm going to wrap it up here and try to be under 30 minutes. But the basic idea that I was trying to get at is Wicca does have a theology. That theology is very basic because so much of it is about the experience of these mysteries that really can't be put into words. And then all of the more developed and robust theology that you encounter is something that someone at some point has kind of built up from that basic starting point to help them. And if it helps you, you can take it on. But if it doesn't help you, look back at that skeletal center and figure out what's going to work for you to help you access those core mysteries. So, all right, I'm going to leave this off here. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you sometime soon.